if I'm sitting with Guy, let's say we're in a circling exercise.
Sure.
And Guy is asking me questions, and he's imagining himself as me, and he's venturing a guess at what I might be feeling or thinking.
Oh.
It's not the astuteness of his imagination that draws me to him. It is the interest that he has in the question itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is what galvanizes me.
I'm joined again by my good friends, Guy Sengstock and Christopher Mastropietro. And we're going to pick up on what we were doing in the previous episode. We were taking a look at I'll call him as neutrally as possible, a thinker who made Dialogos the center of his thought and his framework. This is the work of Martin Buber. And I was very grateful for that discussion. A lot was drawn out and a lot was articulated. There was a lot of insight. Very grateful for that. So first of all, thank you. And then what we're going to try to do is we'll keep doing that, but now we're going to turn the focus of that project onto how could that inform or transform a lot of the practices that have been discussed and demonstrated in this series. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Guy to get it started about some of the insights that caught your eye or your ear, and what you think, how they might help us to, first of all, see more deeply what's already happening in the practices, or perhaps, and that's what I mean by inform, or how it might give us some advice of some maybe possible innovations or modifications we want to bring to the practices that reflect what we've learned from the engagement with Buber's work. So, who would like to go first?
One of the things that we talked about when we actually did the practices episode and explained the dialectic in a Dialogos and did a demonstration of it. And one of the things that I think as we do the workshops, where we have people come and we all just try it out together.
And we just did one 2 weeks ago.
And we just did one 2 weeks ago.
Our fifth one.
Yeah,
our fifth one.
Yeah.
And every time, what's fascinating to me is that every time we do it, I feel as though I understand what we're doing better.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The practice itself becomes more and more of a thou.
Yeah.
In other words, right? Its particular abundance becomes far more open-ended. Even as it becomes tighter and more well-defined, its possibility also becomes more open-ended, which is, I think, an interesting way of understanding the paradox of it, right?
Yep.
We double down on it on the one hand, we clarify on the one hand, and as we clarify and proscribe it in one sense, it also becomes a little bit more open-ended in another sense.
Yeah.
One of the things that is very tempting, even right now, what we're doing, it's very tempting to become attached to the letter of what we say, the proposition of what we say, what we pitch, and what we propose. And think of the insight itself, the semantic content of the insight, as the fruit of the process. And I think as we do it over and over and over again, it becomes very, very clear it's not the fruit of the process, right? That's an instrument in the process. And we were talking about how what is said, part of the irony, I mean that in the technical, sort of the Kierkegaardian sense that you and I were discussing, that part of the irony of the practice is that it's not an exercise to gain objective insight. That's not what it's for. The exercise is to develop a subjective relationship to a virtue. And that the act of proposing in the direction of a virtue is to deepen and unfold that relationship and to become progressively more intimate with it, right? To make it more and more and more and more of a thou. And that's something about the structure of the process and the repetition of the process, repetition in the recollection forward sense, right? Not in the stalled sense, but in the progressive sense of repetition, of vertical repetition, you could say. is that the repetitiousness of the exercise helps to renew the commitment to treat the virtue as a thou. And that commitment has to be renewed every time we propose, we err in the proposal, we know we err in the proposal, and that we have to propose again. And so there's something about that repetitious structure that I think is meant to, when we're doing it properly, renew the commitment to regard the virtue collectively as a thou. And there seems to be something about regarding one another as thou that helps to triangulate that move. And I don't know exactly how that works, but it strikes me that one another, being thou to one another, and that being bidirectional, right? Because there's a certain vulnerability in being a thou, right? So it's having to treat another as a thou, disposing yourself to receive the kind of attention in virtue of which you would become a thou, and then to use that reciprocal opening to understand the virtue on those terms. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because it requires, there's a sacrificial element to it. You have to be willing to err and err again and err again, knowing everything you say is in some sense wrong. Wrong in the sense that it doesn't capture the virtue, right? It's not equal to it. And so in some sense, being in error in the letter of what we say, serves the building and development of the relationship. And it's at the level of the relationship that we come to know the virtue, right? So anyway, maybe I'll start there.
And that thing we were highlighting in the last conversation about in I thou, it's not the question of how you're relevant to me, but how I'm relevant to you. Right. And I would say I really saw this clearly in the last one. I think looking back, I saw it, in every single one, but it was just really prominent in the last one. Yeah, the last workshop. Is this people sharing about their experience, but from that place of being relevant to the virtue, right? There was this kind of there was almost a ecstatic, there was an ecstatic place people were talking about, right? That it's as if they realized that they were significant to the degree that they were able to participate in something glimpsing, where it would start to glimpse the universal thing that when it would catch. There's a sense of being significant in that sense. So it was really thou, right? And the ecstaticness coming from them it was really interesting, because if that was towards themselves, they'd be so inflated, right? But it wasn't an inflation, it was an ecstaticness, right?
So this is this virtuous vulnerability. And because one of the things we warn people about in these practices is try to resist sort of the attractive pull of autobiography, right? Because autobiography is about trying to bend everything towards the self, right? Even though the first autobiography is Augustine actually trying to invert that arrow the other way around. People don't read the Confession, the first great autobiography, or if they do, they don't read it deeply enough to see that that's the point. So the thing I want to ask about that then, and it is, first of all, I want to make one modification. I would want to say that it's not that the I thou isn't subjective objective. I would say the I thou is transjective, from which the subjective and objective poles can be posited. And that what people are realizing with this intimacy that they have not understood before, they've not encountered before, but they've always longed. The only way I can make sense of that kind of Platonic anamnesis, that's Plato's word for remembering or recollecting, is that they've always been operating, if I can put it that way, from transjectivity, but they've never realized, in a phenomenological sense, transjectivity. And I think the I-thou relationship is a profound transjective. We talked about it, it's primordial, it's underneath, right? And it's also generative. It's not just reflective, it's not just representative, it's generative, right? It's creating persons. So what I wanted to say then is, I want to try and bring the question I brought in when we got into the discussion of, there's this interrelationship between discerning the voice, and realizing the I-thou relationship, and being in an aspirational zone of proximal development, right?
Mm.
Is there, it seems to me that what we have to be doing all of that to some degree to get what you're putting your finger on, that people are willing to make turning the arrow around. But I'm wondering again, like part of it is the fact that we choose virtue as a thing, right? Because typically if you ask people, would you want virtues to continue to exist even if you didn't? They say yes. And then, right. So the two that I've been sort of boiling down all of the meaning in life questions to two questions, which is, tell me what you want to exist even if you don't, and tell me how much of a difference you make to it now. And if you got a strong answer to both of those, I predict you'll find your life very meaningful, right? And so we choose a virtue because people generally answer strongly to the first. They would want it to exist in a world even if they didn't exist in that world, because they see sort of the inherent value of virtue or something like that. But we're trying to get them to come into right relationship. And I'm not trying to challenge what you said, Chris. I'm trying to balance it. How do we balance off them, or how could we better do it? Because perhaps I think we must be doing it in some way. How do we balance off them feeling that they matter and make a difference to, they're connected, they're relevant to the virtue? And you'll see this is kind of like the Minos paradox, while also kind of all doing what you said, that they are not coming into a semantic grasp of it. Yeah. So how, this is also the paradox of love, right? So how is it that they can feel that they're in right relationship to it, ratio religio, that they are being relevant to it, while at the same time reminding them that they're probably mistaken about it?
And the it being
the virtue.
The virtue.
Yeah.
Right? So this is you want to say you're probably erring around this, yet that doesn't mean you're not relevantly connected to it.
Yeah.
You see the problem? Sorry, I had to lay out a bit of a preamble to get that.
Right. So how does, in other words, if I can make sure I understand your question, how does error, how does the knowledge of being in error in relation to your apprehension of a virtue incentivize your participation,
or even not
and draw it,
or not even undermine the sense
Yeah.
that you are relevant to it? Because if the project is not how does it matter to me, but how do I matter to it?
Mm.
Typically, when I'm in error about something, I'm in error about mattering to it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Does that make a sense as a problematic? And I'm not here proposing how we change a practice. I'm trying to say, is if we could get a little bit clear about this, we could provide people with better, right? Because like you often express a concern about, don't worry if you're frustrated. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but are we fully engaging with their concern? Their concern might be, but if I'm not actually connecting with it, how could I possibly know if I'm relevantly connected to it or having the right relationship with it?
Mm. Mm.
Now, does that make sense now as a problem?
Yeah.
Yes.
And the first thing that I'm kind of coming to is, I don't think on any of the people who came out and shared about the dialectic and the dialogos that they were just in, that were in that ecstatic place, I don't think any of them said like, we clearly got it right.
Right.
Like, I don't think any of them said that, actually.
Yes, I agree, totally.
In fact, I'd say that it was precisely in that they hit an aporia, yet they were in relationship with it while not being able to put it into words.
Right.
In the right words.
Yeah.
that somehow not being able to put it in the right words, but still being in contact with it, actually had it mean more somehow.
Right, because I think the non-propositional
Yeah,
connectedness, the religio is
yeah,
more important,
yeah,
right? So I agree that that's happening.
yeah.
And okay, you want to say something?
Yeah, so using that exact point, I think it has something to do with interest. So let's imagine for a second, because what's happening in philosophical fellowship, right?
Right,
We did it with Buber, for
right.
instance, right? Whereas we're circumambulating Buber, or encircling the way that you're doing it with an individual who's present, or in dialectic and Dialogos, the way that we're doing it with a virtue. What is being expressed and and um, and conjured again and again and again is the interest that we have in the coming to know of, whether it be the virtue or the person.
A kind of wonder.
Wonder. So let's maybe take the analogy of the I thou between two people,
Okay.
right? Let's do that. Let's do that for a moment and see if we can maybe carry it over to the virtue. If I'm sitting with Guy, let's say we're in a circling exercise.
Sure.
And Guy is asking me questions, and he's imagining himself as me, and he's venturing a guess at what I might be feeling or thinking.
Oh,
It's not the astuteness of his imagination that draws me to him. It is the interest that he has in the question itself.
yeah.
That is what galvanizes me. That's what makes me commit to the interaction with him. He might say, I'm imagining something about you, and he might be completely off. Usually it doesn't happen, incidentally. We're usually pretty good.
Devastatingly so at times.
Yeah. But he might be completely off, but that actually doesn't deter me. What attracts me to the conversation and the interaction to him, what magnetizes me to him, is the interest he casts to me in the proposal that he makes. It is the gesture of the proposal, far more than the exactitude of its content, that actually opens up the relationship. And in fact, depending on the kind of error he makes, he may make errors in such an interesting way. He might be wrong in ways that are so insightful in and of themselves that they might actually open possibilities in how I imagine myself that isn't what I imagined at all. It's not him according with me or to me. It has everything to do, it's far more related to attitude than it is related to precision. Now, I don't know how much that carries over to when we're talking about the virtue, but I do think that there is something about the nature of being in error in an exercise like that is a demonstration of interest as in commitment. Right? In that sense, right, we compare this a lot to very dramatic exercises like improvisation. There's a hell of a lot of improvisation in this kind of exercise,
sure.
right? It's an artistic exercise in as much as it is anything else. And because of that, making creative errors isn't, to use that terrible, tired expression, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's actually what opens up the possibility. So error is necessary, right? It's necessary because part of this is actually a creative enterprise.
So I think this isn't exactly what you're saying, but it's what it's sparking in me, which is an instance of exactly what I'm going to talk about. So it's not the content of the error. It is like when you're on an errand and the two words are related in that the errors are actually helping evolve you towards the thing. It's something like the affordance of of reciprocal change and the rate at which you feel the person is homing in on you. Like if for example, we don't like interest that is not doing that. That's the stalker, and we don't regard that as something positive. We regard that as something very, very negative, right? And if the errors that Guy were making were neither systematic towards you or systematic of him, let me explain what I mean by that. So one of the great insights of Piaget is everybody was doing IQ testing way before him, and they were throwing away the error and only looking at the success rate. And then Piaget said, I wonder if the errors are systematic, if there are patterns in the error, because the systematic error actually reveals the competence of an individual rather than just circumstance. And lo and behold, there's systematicity in the error. And what I mean by that is if his errors, if they have this kind of ordering, rather than the content of the error, you get a sense of how he is constraining.
Yeah.
And also, right,
Mhm.
right, so you get insight into him, but you also get the way he's giving you feedback
Yeah.
on the errors is also giving you information about the constraint. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And this is, Heidegger's notion of the connections between error and going on an errand, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And right.
Yeah.
And so the idea that,
Interesting.
and I'm trying to get on your notion here, but that there's something disclosing about the self-organizing pattern. There's a logos
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
in the error
Yeah.
that, right, is nevertheless the logos, right?
Yes, yes.
Right. And so in a predictive processing framework, right, the system doesn't orient just to error.
Mhm.
It orients to patterns of error and rates of error,
Yeah.
right? Because those are actually deeply informative about how it should update its model.
Yes.
Right.
Is that?
And that's why, boy,
Yeah.
yes. And that's why giving an account of your error, which there's a sacrament for, we
Yeah.
talked about in reference to Kierkegaard,
Yeah.
called confession,
Yeah.
is actually an instance of the logos, right?
Yeah.
Being accountable to, giving account of is exactly the act of gathering oneself together and making conscious to oneself and to the thou you're facing what the constraints of your
Yeah.
encounter actually are, such that you can know them.
I'm going to throw in one more piece of cog sci, and then talk about a sort of a meta virtue that is, I think, we there's, like, we were thinking about maybe sophron as a meta virtue, but I'll come around to this. So one of the heuristics that's proposed for enhancing insight, the hot insight, is called the notice and variance heuristic. And what this heuristic is I failed to formulate this problem. 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 Now I can just leave that as arbitrary, or I can say, maybe there's systematicity in my error. I'm going to look for what I'm not changing in each one of my mistakes, because that's probably a good thing to try and change. So I'll get success, and that will actually provoke insight.
Yeah.
But that requires a terrific kind of epistemic humility. It requires you to look at the errors and like pay serious attention in them in order to, right, see if there might be systematicity in the error, because that can actually disclose. So if you're seeing that, that you're getting the feedback and you're realizing that, there's a certain kind of constraint that might be limiting, right, from the systematicity in the error, then well, maybe that's what I press on. Maybe that's what I challenge or open up, because then that could get me closer to the connection.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Okay, but here's the problem.
Yeah.
That works really well as a model of you and I. How does it work when we're doing it with a virtue?
Right.
Because the virtue, like we are in a weird double role. First of all, the meta virtue of humility comes to the fore, but we are somehow having to stand in for the virtue for each other and act as the feedback on that. We are giving the voice to the virtue by which it does this with each other.
Yes.
Yeah. And what is it? What is it then that is letting us know, yay, no?
Exactly.
If it's not, if I don't have the authority on the virtue and you don't have the authority on the virtue, what exactly are we? What's giving us?
So is there a possibility
Yeah.
that, right, we are also, we're at least implicit learning, and I mean that like in the cog sci sense, we're picking up on patterns in each other and through each other of ourselves, and that we're actually using that to give voice to the virtue, to tell us how, whether or not we're sort of dead reckoning towards the virtue.
Yeah.
So the WeSpace is a defining constitutive feature of this working. Right. That's a fundamental way in which it's different from dialogue. because this we space is performing an irreplaceable role that can't be captured in traditional, just interpersonal dialogue.
Right.
That's the argument
Yeah.
I'm making.
So I just want to make sure I'm getting what you're saying. So there's a way that we're implicitly recognizing,
Yes.
right, patterns in each other's bodies, tonalities.
I'm almost guaranteeing you
Yeah.
that we're
Oh,
doing
yeah.
this. That's how implicit learning
Totally.
works.
Totally.
And the Geist comes out of that.
Right.
And then the Geist is what gives voice to the virtue. And that is the only way we could do it. Whereas if we didn't have the we space, the Geist, the Logos, as an agent, there was nothing to give voice to the virtue so that we could enter into an I-thou relationship with it.
Right.
Okay, so this is good. So then what's the relationship between the emergence of the Geist from that we space and the vulnerability that we dispose toward error and the consciousness of that error? How do that? Because I think there's a connection there. What is that?
Well, I mean, from a cog sci perspective, and that's not going to be sufficient. We're going to have to bring it back into the existential. So this is just to get the ball rolling. I think what we're getting, and this is a way of, again, sort of understanding vulnerability. And I'm just on the edge of this, so give me space. But right, remember that I was saying about the systematicity, the conatus, right, the rate of the error being information independent of the content of the error, right? And so, what if, as we are open to the Geist, we are experiencing an enhancement of the rate at which we feel we are moving towards the virtue.
Say that one more time, if you would.
Yeah. So the Geist is constellated, and then the Geist has, and I'm not saying a consciousness, but the Geist has, it has a collective intelligence, right, that is giving us this guidance of how to move towards the virtue, giving voice to the virtue. And what if we are picking up that our vulnerability to that is being rewarded, I'm trying to use some of the language, rewarded by an increase in the rate in which we are feeling guided by the Geist.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the feedback. The sense of the sacrifice of my vulnerability towards it, right? The rate in which that vulnerability is fed back is like on, off, is coming from the Geist.
Yes.
Right. And in the slowness or the rapidity of that is what's giving that's the relationship between the vulnerability and the Geist.
Right.
Right.
And so the way I would then try and bring it a little bit more is that we've talked about this as a flow state this way.
Yeah.
But I'm now thinking that there's something like a flow state this way between us and the Geist. And as long as we're in the flow state, we're getting basic feedback. Keep doing what you're doing. Now, the flow state is not perfect, but it's really, really good, right? I mean, all the arguments, the Hogarth and the stuff that Leo and I, published about. And so, but what I'm trying to get at is I'm trying to get at a non-supernaturalistic account of what it is when we're talking about the voice of the virtue. I think the Geist takes shape this way, and we get religio, we get bound to it and with each other to it in this way, such that it becomes the voice of the virtue.
Yeah, we conform.
So the virtue can become a thou for us, because the virtue is not a thou in and of itself, right? Right.
Yeah. So that collective presence that emerges gives us a kind of generalized model of error and reflects it back. And basically the reflection of that generalized model of error becomes then the center of the dialogue.
Right. It's like how each one of us is sort of picking up on an aspect of Spinoza in the philosophical fellowship. And we all know, at least implicitly, it's inadequate. But the sense of somehow between all of these, we could remove bias and get closer back
Yeah.
to the original presence of the
Yeah.
perspective
Right.
of Spinoza. Is something like that.
Right. But it's almost a negative presence, right? In the sense that however it is that
It's like Socrates' demonium. It's not telling you what to do. It's only
telling you what not to do.
It's telling you when you're erring
Right.
beyond the point of where you can return to
Right.
to
It
track.
dialogues with your error, in effect, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I think properly understood, and this goes to some stuff that we were talking about with one of the crew
The
during the
negative
break.
theology.
Well, not just the negative theology. I'm proposing the Geist as the persona for the virtue.
Right. Yeah. So it's a kind of gradual emptying out.
Yes.
Right. And of
Yeah.
course, that's what the Dialogos is, right? It's a gradual, it's a kenosis. It's
Yeah.
a gradual withdrawal and emptying of the virtue unto itself. The more that the error gives greater resolution and negative reference to it as it withdraws.
Yeah.
So
Something like that.
I think we're saying the same thing. What I'm saying is I think the Geist provides the face for the virtue so that we can face it in an I-thou relationship.
Right.
But like a persona, it is always properly presenting, but also withdrawing.
Right.
This negativity strikes me as super important.
Okay,
Right.
Go with that.
I just had this thought the other day. It was about the logos, and I was thinking about, like, is it really true that we address the logos? And I don't think so. I think it's always true that the logos addresses us. In fact, and then I started thinking about, what is it to have an address? Well, I have an address. You have an address. You have an address.
Sure.
But does the logos have the address? No, the logos addresses, right, the ones who have the address. In fact, the fact that where I live and where you live and where you live is probably like through the interaction of the logos, right, and our identities and where we are. But the logos itself, right, seems to withdraw. It doesn't have an address. It addresses, but and we answer its call, but we don't know where it is. There's this kind of constant relationship where it addresses us. We always hear the call of the logos. And I think this is what's going on in the circling of this is that we're hearing the ring of something, but it's got a negative withdrawing quality to it, right?
So I think this is good, but I want to play with it and probe it.
Yeah.
Right. Because there is a dialogical sense. So what I hear you saying is there's a sense in which we feel the logos is voicing to us, speaking to us, right? But we don't speak back. But of course, you have a whole tradition, Christianity, that claims that the face of the logos is such that we can speak to, not just be spoken to. Right. And this, of course, is Christ as the logos. Right. So sometimes the persona, at least in one tradition, maybe others, but this is the one I'm familiar with. Sometimes the persona is a person in the sense of hypostasis, not in the sense of a human being. Right? Something we speak to, not only something that can speak to us. So do you see what I'm saying?
Yes,
How I'm challenging? But I'm not sure about that either. I'm bringing this into, because we want to give people the clearest possible way in which they can articulate this experience to themselves, so it doesn't become confused or vague without being falsely precise. But do you see the challenge I'm raising?
Yes.
So for me, this is part of the Socrates Kierkegaard thing too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've said it. We've said at times that one way, and this is no less abstruse, but let's see what we can do with it, is that, okay, I like this idea that we're basically tracking with a withdrawal of the logos, right? And the reason that error is necessary in that project is that it is being an error that tracks the withdrawal, because it is everything that is not what we say of it, everything that's not what we profess of it, everything that's not what we propose.
But not just empty negation.
Right? That it's, so, one insight I remember came up in one of our dialogues some time ago is that the relationship between speech and silence
Yeah.
in terms of its conveyance reverses
Yeah.
in Dialogos, right?
Yes.
Or at least by analogy, I find it very helpful to think of it that way, so that we're used to thinking, well, I convey by my speech and I listen with my silence. Seems to be inverse. It seems to be that the conveyance of the virtue is actually the silence. It's in the aporia. It's in the ringing that follows the speech, and that the act of the speech is actually an act of listening, right? The probing is in the speech.
Yes.
The probing is in the speech. The listening effort is in the speech, and then the spokenness of the virtue is actually in the silence that precedes it, that follows it, that braces it from all sides. Right? That's why it's negative, right? Not as a negation, but a pregnant negative, right? And so, that being the case, if we think of every act of speech in Dialogos as an instance of listening, and every instance of silence in Dialogos is actually the act of speaking forth the virtue, using one another's generalized error as the measure of listening, what happens to this?
I think what you said was very astute, and I'm trying to process it in terms of, I'm trying to get who's the thou with in the relationship to the virtue. And this is, I'm trying to get the notion of the persona, that the Geist is something that is present, and therefore it can take on the role of presentation, the speaking to us. It can be the persona, the mask, right? And I'm trying to connect that with what you just said, like, right?
Because let me just add one more thing, because you brought up Jesus Christ as an example, right? The logos of Christ in the Christian tradition as being an example of
the persona is actually a person,
right? And I'm trying to think of, I'm trying to think of examples, scriptural examples of the various interactions that Christ has with people in Scripture, and there are. There are surely many that I probably contradict this observation I'm about to make. God knows it's not exhaustive. But in every example that I think of, when I think about those interactions, whatever is professed to him, whatever is spoken to him, is always erroneous.
Yes.
Right? Always.
Yes.
Right? I say something to Christ, and Christ says, no, it's...
Yes.
Right? Christ, nope.
It's a
right?
shift.
It's always a shift away. He always withdraws from what is said to him,
and Socrates
he
won't
always
actually pronounce
repositions
either.
it, and Socrates too, right? So he always withdraws from the framing of what is said. He always reframes and repositions, and he always answers in ways that were not anticipated by the formulation of the question, right? So take that analogy and shift it onto this example, right? We don't have Jesus Christ to talk to. But if we think of the silent presence of the virtue as doing something analogous to that every time we speak into it, now we have to listen for it, right? We have to use our ear to substitute. So I think it was a conversation you had, to give him proper credit for this insight. I think it was O.G. Rose. One of your conversations with him, he said something I thought was very insightful, which was an observation he made about this practice, which is that it often happens, God knows I do this all the time, which is that, we'll make a proposal. I'll make a proposal and I'll go, no, that's not it. Right? Right? I'll make a proposal and you'll go, what did it feel like to hear that? Well, it felt wrong. I'll make a proposal. What did it feel like? Nope, it's wrong. I'm listening with my own ear. I'm listening with my own ear, and we're doing that collectively in the space, right? We're listening for it. And the listening for it seems to take place in the abiding silence that accompanies whatever it is that we say, right? So that sort of scriptural reference is just an analogy to say that if we're listening properly, meaning if we're speaking properly, we hear the error in our own voice when we're listening on account of the virtue. So what's happening when we do that?
So you're proposing that we although we're speaking, we're actually listening in the speaking. So it's still ultimately the virtue speaking to us through the persona of the Geist, of the Logos itself.
That sounds right.
Okay, but then maybe I'm just being overly scientific here, but
Someone has to be.
well, I want to say, right, so the thing in the analogy is Christ as the person behind the persona, right? And he constantly is rejecting the wrong persona. That's why the shift keeps happening.
Yep.
Right? But if the Geist is the persona, what is rejecting, right? What's behind it doing the rejecting? Is it something like the world or being? There is something that we are accounting ourselves to, but right, that has a causal impact on the conversation, that is giving that part of the I thou to the virtue. So I'm breaking the thou into, right, the way it can face us, and that's the Geist. But I'm also saying the thou is that which withdraws. That's your point.
Yep.
And what is it that's it's not the virtue, right? So what is it that's withdrawing, but withdrawing in such a way that it is conveying to us the virtue? And is it something like the way we are fitted to the world, or the world is disclosing itself to us? Understand?
I do. I understand. I think I understand that. I think you described that as being the Logos, if I recall. Right?
Yeah.
Do you want to say something about that?
So, but this may be important. This may be that maybe there's two senses of this word, or maybe we should split it up into the Geist, which is the persona generated by the WeSpace, and then the Logos is something like the way the world, right, withdraws, or something like that. That's really vague.
Is the Geist the persona of the Logos? Is that the move you're making? Because that's interesting. That's an interesting way of formulating it.
And I'm just thinking of it now, because I'm trying to get a sense of the different intimacies. So there's this philia, that's intimacy. And then the intimacy with the WeSpace is this relationship with the Geist. But then people get an intimacy with being itself. And that seems to me the fullest version of the Logos.
That seems to be, to me, that seems to be the being itself seems to be something like the openness that the very, whatever it accounts for us to be open to each other, to have this and all of that, the factor or the facticity of that openness, or not facticity, the primordialness of that openness shines through, right?
But yes, but I'm trying to get at, like persons have a suchness, what? Okay, so the Geist gives the face to the virtue. That seems to be something we're at least got a little bit of traction on. But there's something behind that does the shifting, and it's got to be something that is specific to courage, as opposed to kindness, as opposed to sophronism. Do you understand? It can't just be the general withdrawal of being.
Although, perhaps, but one of the things that we consistently hear when we do the workshops is that the deeper people get into the process, and the further that the practice gets, even in a single sitting, the more the interdependency between the virtues becomes manifest in the dialogue. So one of the things that I consistently hear, I think, we talked about this a little bit, because it came out in the most recent one, which was very interesting, is that it seems to be that the more Dialogos actually catches in the practice, the more that the virtue itself that is under discussion, when probed, when known, when intimated more and more and more, reveals its interdependency with all of the other virtues. It opens, it fans out.
Right, but it doesn't fan out into a homogeneous blob.
No, it fans out into a multiplicity.
It fans out into what Plotinus thought of the nous. It fans out into the holographic relationship with all of the different between all the forms.
Right. But what I'm saying is, you said, well, the thing that is withdrawing has to have something to do with courage. Right. If courage is the virtue that is subject to the dialectic, then the withdrawal of the virtue has to somehow.
Oh, so let me see if I understand this. So when the virtue, when we're getting that withdrawal into the hologram of all the virtues, right? That is when the intimacy with being is coming. Is that what you're saying?
I think so.
Yeah.
Because that is sort of the grammar of intelligibility itself, not the meaning of any particular virtue.
That's
virtue.
right. Yeah. That's right. So as the so the persona is the persona is the specificity of the virtue that we're trying to access.
Yeah.
And the withdrawal is something like the opening of that one virtue into the good itself.
The thing that made all of it possible in the first place. But
right. Okay, so then we have sort of the two components for how we could enter into an I-thou relationship with a virtue. We have the WeSpace taking on the role of the persona and giving voice to the virtue. And then we have the withdrawal into, the system of intelligibility, something analogous to the Platonic forms.
The one-ing.
The one-ing, which acts as the mystery of a person.
Yeah. There it is. Right.
God, we're so cartoonish.
The suchness and the moreness.
Exactly. Yeah. But articulated in this specific way. And so it might mean that theoretically we might want to, we've been using Geist and Logos interchangeably, but it might be that we want to actually differentiate them in order to pick up on these different layers of the phenomenology.
Right. No, I think this works much better. It works much better because then the Logos is properly a movement of withdrawal away from the Dialogos itself, right? It's the movement of the part.
See, I would want to say
not away from the Dialogos. It's within and around and through. But we talk about the movement of Logos as being the gathering of Logos as being a movement from the part to the whole.
Right.
And it makes sense in that respect that the movement of a single virtue to virtue itself,
I think it's both,
it tracks that exact pattern.
I think it's both. It's the ascent and I think the accountability of the Logos is not just the withdrawal, but also the fact that it faces us.
Yeah. And I just want to make sure that I'm getting what you just said is like, it's the I thou with the virtue is established because as we speak into and distinguish the virtue and it comes to present, that's like the persona.
Yes, that's right.
Right. That's the face.
Yeah.
Right. But then at some point that which withdraws, but yet shines through it and withdrawals is the intelligibility.
Yes.
Of the,
but not a particular intelligibility. We're
it's like general,
putting into a network of intelligibility that gets us some of the profound patterns and principles of reality itself.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that starts to come through the persona. We start to see, through this virtue, all the other virtues start to speak.
And I'm proposing that I can face Chris because he literally has a face, but then he also has an enacted face, the persona.
Yeah.
Right. And that's and that's how I can be. I need something to account to.
Yeah.
But he is also his suke is the through line of all of his aspects. Right.
Yeah.
And they form like what we're doing with all of the virtues. They have to. So he withdraws into that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a through line that is incompletable and is not any one of his aspects. That's the mystery.
Right.
Right. And so I come into an I-thou relationship with something when I can do that, and I can do it most properly with people, for the persons, for the reasons. And I'm trying to get at how could we possibly do it with an entity that is in some ways only an abstract entity, a virtue.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to say we get this error systematicity, this self-organizing of error that in the WeSpace. So the WeSpace can give us feedback. It can be the face, the persona of the virtue.
Yeah.
And then the way the virtue is multi-aspectual with all the other, right?
Yeah.
Right.
That's analogous, at least, to the mystery of a person. And that's how we can enter into a deep I-thou relationship with a virtue.
Yes.
And then what that might mean is we could give better guidance, better pedagogical instruction to people if we try to break up the phenomenology, because we've been noting these sequence of intimacies for quite some time, and we've just been sort of noting it. But if we could properly give people a framework and then attach, well, this is how this is, and this is how his experience and how it's functioning,
Yeah.
we might be able to make them more fluid as they move into the process.
Right.
That's what I'm proposing.
Right.
That's so interesting because it's consonant with the sort of anagogy in the symposium, right? It's the withdrawal of the beloved,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
the Socratic era, the eros directed towards Socrates, is basically left. It's basically led into aporia because of the withdrawal of Socrates as the beloved object of the eros.
But he's the figure.
And that's what the virtue is doing.
Right. But remember what about Socrates? He's like one of those statues, right? There is the persona that, and you try and open it up, and then there's something different inside the treasure.
Yeah.
Right. But right. I'm trying to get that Socrates, and this is part of the Socratic irony, is Socrates properly faces his interlocutor. In fact, he's famous for being able to shift his persona.
Yeah.
And you pointed about how Christ shifts away, but Christ also shifts into. Christ also can adapt himself to say the right thing.
Yes.
To the person in that situation.
Yes, that's true. So there's a bidirectional movement, which is exactly, I think, what you've been trying to say, right? There's a bidirectional movement here, right? There's sort of an infinitizing movement away.
Yes.
Right? The sort of inexhaustible open-endedness that's opened by the withdrawal. And there's also a kind of binding.
Yes, a religio.
Yep.
Right.
That's what I'm... And so if we can more properly articulate the dimensions and the moments, I mean that in a phenomenological sense, of this, and perhaps be a little bit more precise in the terms we're using for different moments and dimensions, I think we could give more helpful pedagogical advice to people who are undertaking the practice.
It's like we can start to use this, poetically and technically use this language where it's like, can we start to see the face of the virtue? Is it coming?
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Are we putting skin on the ghost in some sense?
Skin
right?
on a ghost.
Yeah. Yes.
Great way of putting it.
And that how we like I said, but let's not forget the original gem that started it. It's not the content of our error.
Right.
It's the way the error has a systematicity, right? Well, it has a logos to it, and a kinetis. And that right, that gets constellated in the WeSpace as something that is giving us guidance that no one of us can give to ourselves, or we can't even give to each other dyadically.
Yeah.
Something's bothering you?
No. There's some intuition that something about the way that, like, let's think about error in terms of finitude for a moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Error it evidences the way in which we're circumscribed and finite, that there's a lot that we don't have access to, right? That we're confined to perspective and don't have an infinite array of them at our disposal. And our aspectualization of virtue itself into a particular virtue has something to do with those constraints, right? So the way that we're generalizing or modeling on our own error, I think, has a correspondence to the way that we're aspectualizing virtue itself into something in particular, right? And so...
Oh, that's good.
Right? And so there's something about accounting for one's error that realizes a person as being exactly the kind of person that one is, right?
Well, that's what I meant earlier, but the systematicity in the error can actually disclose to you the constraints that are largely transparent to you.
That's right. So I'm just trying to find I'm trying to repeat this so that we better understand the move that we're making. So that's something about the generalized model, that the Geist that emerges as a reflection of the collective WeSpace, which is really a reflection of our collective error, is basically it's a facing of one's own error.
But that's what I want to say. That's why I wanted to intervene. It's not just collective error, because the collective error affords something like the notice invariance heuristic, which tells you what you might want to change in order to reduce the error. Remember, you can... The more multi-aspects I bring, so I get all of these aspects and they're all in error in some way. Then what I can look for is what is not changing across all the aspects, because it's doing one of two things. It's showing me something beyond that I don't understand, or very often what it's showing you is a constraint that you have built in that needs to be given up in order to stop making the same mistake over and over again.
Yeah.
Right. That's when that, and it's in that the possibility opens back up.
Exactly. So
Right.
that's what I want to say, that the Geist is not just our collective error. It's a collective error and something like the collective affordance of the notice and variance heuristic
Yeah.
application that none of us are capable of individually.
Right.
So we
Yeah.
we can open up how many perspectives are in error so that we have a greater chance of finding the deeper invariant that we need to challenge.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So then it's in the process. It's in the process of collectively accounting for the error that opens up a kairos of passing beyond it.
So I'm basically saying, like, if we could, what we're doing here, and we could continue, is if we could sort of more articulate the phenomenology of what's happening, we could give more pedagogical help so that the proper functioning is more and more afforded. That's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is sort of synchronizing with something one of the things we've been trying to do is understand how the project of coming into relation with a virtue is related to the project of self-knowledge, right? That dimension to the Socratic project, right? Because it's in virtue of knowing what, not in any final or exhaustive way, but it's in part in virtue of coming to know the kind of thing that you are, that you understand where you end and where everything else begins. And there is something about the confirmation of, not the confirmation in the logical sense, but the confirmation of error, or the embodiment of error, that brings you into
the coherence.
The coherence of error, sure, yeah. The sort of the coming into consciousness of error brings you consciously into resolution for yourself. And it has, we were talking about that in respect of Kierkegaard, right? That the giving account of yourself in the form of confession brings a kind of lucidity to yourself and the constraints that bind you to being exactly the kind of thing that you are. And it's the gathering together of that consciousness of error that binds you to yourself as you are necessarily. And that seems to be a precondition for being able to participate in everything that's beyond you, right? So that's part of that bidirectional move, right? You're coming into clarity.
Yes.
Right? Not exhaustive clarity, but graduating clarity about yourself. And that's also allowing for and affording a movement in the other direction, which is to say, I can't be everything. But if I can understand the kind of thing I am and be it wettedly, committedly, I can participate in everything.
That's excellent. So that's really good. So does that mean that confession, I'm going to have to twist the meaning of the word, but I want to twist it to bring out a contrast, like I've sometimes done with other words. The confession is a practice for the cultivation of humility. It is a kind of humiliation experience.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And even the fact that that word has become negative, purely negative, means it's very difficult for us to pay attention to gather together in a logos, to gather together so they belong together, our errors, so that they cohere and we find ourselves accountable to them.
Yes.
Right? And so so I'm trying to get the word humiliation to be the act of, like, encouragement. Right.
Yeah. There's that reversal.
Yes. Yes.
That through line with the logo, the virtue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that significance line.
Right. Exactly. And so, but yes. And that's amplifying what I'm saying. And then, do you then see confession as the practice of humiliation?
Yes, I do.
In the sense I'm now twisting it to.
I
twisting it back to what it originally meant.
I do, and it's a humiliation, and it's a sensitization. It's a disposing of oneself in vulnerability. It is what allows one to willingly become a thou.
Yeah.
Right? So if I were to convert that back into its Christian language, it would be something like sensitizing myself to receive the solicitous Son, the love of God, right? Which is in that tradition one of the greatest sin, which is to refuse to be a thou before the one.
Right.
And
this is all through Dante.
Of course, yeah, absolutely, right? To refuse to be a thou before the one, to refuse the love of being so known and thus to be forgiven by him.
Because you're refusing the call to personhood,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
means you're fundamentally undermining the capacity that is fundamental of agape, which is the constitutive call to your personhood.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, I hadn't
Refusing
thought about
that
that.
agape. And so
This is a
confession,
different understanding
confession
of
is a
sin.
preparation.
Oh, yeah.
Confession, in some sense, we talked about this with Kierkegaard, confession is a Socratic preparation to receive agape, right? It is a Socratic self-knowledge and preparation to receive agape, right? It's a bringing into vivid lucidity the error in order for the possibility of being beyond it, being known beyond it. Because when it becomes the measure of all that's real, you have to be known away from it, right? And you have to become a thou for that to happen.
So, I mean, I don't want to completely lose what Guy said. There's this reversal, and there's this, you're starting to track the through line of the soul in an important way. That's what you were referring to. And that is tracking the through line of the soul, or the suke, right, is a way of participating in the tracking of the through line of external reality as well. And so you're coming into a proper participatory relationship. I'm trying to get a cognitive aspect to the affective aspect that you're bringing out with agape. Does that track? Those two go together?
I think so.
That's really, really interesting. Because it reminds me of work of Jaspers and others about the limit situations being and this ultimately I think comes from Kierkegaard, the limit situations being the ones where we really get the self-knowledge that is usually hidden under our autobiography in profound ways. And you can see a lot of therapy about trying to get people to that humiliation such that they get underneath their autobiography to find the actual through line in their error.
Augustine, right? You brought it up already, right? Augustine's Confessions is somehow doing that. It's not about the autobiography. It's about tracing the through line of error through the autobiography.
So he can see the hand of God.
So that he can see the hand of God. Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. So in this, and bring this back to dialectic and Dialogos. So this tracing of error. So I'm getting these two shapes emerging. There's the shape of the errors that I make in my propositions that are like almost not right.
Right.
You're putting skin on the virtue. It becomes persona.
Yeah.
In that sense. But what I'm doing is I'm confessing sins with every single.
Yeah.
I keep confessing, right, and it keeps saying nope, 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 nope. But as it's doing that, it's becoming this negative image, right?
Yeah.
In some sense, and that starts to shine through the
more facets.
Being starts to shine through sin, right? Yeah, exactly. My own shape, all of that kind of comes together.
Yeah.
So I'm playing on face and facets.
Yeah.
As we give more facets to the face, we get more access to the holographic, system of intelligibility.
Yes.
Right. We have different.
Right.
It's like the compound eye of a fly or something like that. Right. Very much.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And more access to the patterns of our own relationship that we brought in. The exercise.
And here's the bringing it back to the vulnerability and the humiliation.
Yeah.
Right. It's a very different feeling. You're right. It's like this making a proposition, going through the dialectic, is this in some senses continually making this error, right? The through lines through that, but also is this confession, which is somehow, as you were saying, giving me my own shape in some way.
Yes. Yeah. And think about how this tracks with one of the most reliable reports we get from people. They come into awe.
Yeah.
And awe is a situation, and this is measurable in experimentation, one of the few situations where the sense of self is diminished, but it's not experienced as threat.
Yeah.
It's experienced as what we're talking about here, right? And it's experienced as something like right? A sensitized vulnerability that opens you to reality in a way that you were not previously capable of.
Yeah.
And people regularly say they always have been thinking, they often care about or think about honesty, but now they're in awe
Yeah.
of the virtue. They'll
Yeah.
say things like that
Yeah.
very reliably too.
Yeah. Totally.
Well, I think this is
Awesome.
yes, I think this was awesome and
Yeah.
not awful,
Yeah.
thankfully. So I want to thank everybody again for watching this. We're going to move the next two episodes. Taylor's going to be joining us again. And the first thing we're going to do in the next episode is we're going to do dialectic into Dialogos. And the virtue we're going to do it on is dialectic itself. And these two episodes serve as the framework for that, for you to following it. And then the following wrap-up episode will be a discussion about what do we mean by dialogos? How is it different from just dialogue or discussion or conversation? Drawing this all together and trying to really clearly articulate it as a way of launching the four of us into a collective, hopefully flowing reflection on why are all of these dialogical practices and communities emerging spontaneously all around the world right now.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, as always, for your time and attention. And thank you, Chris and Guy.
We are had by the dialectic when the dialectic is actually taking effect. And that's what makes it participatory, right? It's not something that we have in hand, but we are had in its hand.